Terrific. Hello, everybody. This is David Falchuk, Executive Director of the American Wine Society. I trust everybody can hear me and see the screen featuring Yeast Nutrition and Health with Tom Payette. Terrific. Well, before we get to Tom, there's a few things I want to talk about. There's a few things I'd like to talk about. Let's see here. I have too many overlapping. First of all, for those of you who are guests, and we are happy to have our guests here, I'd like to say a little bit about the American Wine Society. The American Wine Society is a 501c3 with a nonprofit mission of promoting wine appreciation through education. We're the oldest and largest organization of wine consumers in the US. We have chapters around the country and a great magazine that just won an award for publication excellence. And for the rest of 2022, membership is just $35. So I encourage you to go to AmericanWineSociety.org, consider joining and be part of our national community of wine appreciators. I also want to remind everybody of the upcoming AWS conference. It's our 55th national conference in Bellevue, Washington, our first conference in the Evergreen State, and it is going to be between October 27 and 29, and we have an exciting agenda that is out and has been released. If you'd like more information on it, you can go to AmericanWineSociety.org/national conference, and we'd love to see you there. There are still registrations available. Another thing I would like to talk about is, we have this winemaker session because the AWS wants to be your partner in making better wine. And part of that has been the AWS Amateur Wine Competition, which is one of the oldest national amateur wine competitions in the country. It's judged as part of our conference, and we would like to encourage you to enter our competition so that we can recognize your great work. So you can find that at awscompetitions.com. And I think we have somebody from the competition here. Vince, are you there? Would you like to say a few words?
Thanks, David. So as David mentioned, we've been around for a little while doing these competitions. One of the things we strive to do is provide really good comments back to the winemakers while also not breaking the bank, because we only require one bottle. 750 bottle. That's it. Unlike our commercial side, where we have to get a few extra bottles. But registration is now open, and we'll be closing registration on October 7th. So you only got a few days left.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much, Vince. Another thing I would like to add is the valuable AWS Education Programs. There are winemakers who have gone through these programs and have really done a great job making better wine. The AWS has its own wine judge certification program, which many amateur winemakers go through, and it's more than any other wine education program. WJCP is focused on faults identification, much more so than you'll see in any other wine training. So that's particularly helpful if you're an amateur winemaker. Also, we're an approved program provider for Wine and Spirit Education Trust. And also we have a program called Wine Smarts. And if you think you might need a little bit more confidence before you take on a bigger certification, or if you want to get more general wine knowledge under your belt, I'll tell you what, Wine Smarts is a great start before you decide to go on to, it more than prepares you for WJCP Wine 2 and for year 1 of the Wine Judge Certification Program. So keep that in mind, that we have those opportunities available for you and everyone else as well. I also would like to tease our next presenter after Mr. Payette, Understanding and Adjusting Wine Tannins with Frank Rinaldi of Musto Grape Company. And mark your calendars. It's going to be 8 p.m. Eastern Time, Thursday, October 6th, 2022. And if you're an AWS member and you have registered for this, we'll make sure we let you know. Or if you don't hear from us, you don't get the emails, just reach out and we'll make sure to share the link with you. Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to go back to Mr. Tom Payette. And let me tell you, I've known Tom Payette for a long time. And he's probably the nicest guy you're going to meet in the wine industry and possibly any industry. I mean, this guy has made wine on both coasts and some places in between for a lot of years, both as an in-house winemaker and both as a consultant. Many, many years ago, he and I used to work for something that was called a magazine together. Now, I think what Tom did for the magazine was much more valuable than what I did. but it was a great experience. And Tom has always been quick to share his knowledge with commercial and amateur winemakers. And I'm telling you, I'm very happy he's here today. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to turn things over to Tom. And ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Tom Payette.
Hey, well, thank you very much, Dave. And yeah, it's neat. You go back a good number of years, which is a lot of fun. Boy, they click by very quick too. What a fun industry. Well, thank you very much. And I guess, yes, a lot of my career has all been in Virginia. Plus, let me mention, I don't have any slides, but get out a pen and paper and we'll definitely go over some questions after the presentation and go from there. But yes, been in the industry since really 1985. And my start was really in Virginia Tech in college, receiving a food science technology degree. And a very nice gentleman there, it was before Bruce Auckland got to Virginia Tech, but a nice professor took me under his wing and taught me really everything he could. And I helped him with some of his courses. After that, I went ahead and got a job in the industry for minimum wage. So it's one of those things, you have a college degree, but you've got a passion. And maybe you could say it was a lack of passion for the food industry. I didn't want to be in a white lab jacket testing green beans or tomato juice all my life, and chose the wine business after I'd worked a few summers in the vineyards. So found that I really, really did enjoy it and had that passion, you could say. It's been my only career. So really, I haven't jumped in and out of it. It's always been what I did ever since college. So in Virginia, that winery was a 250,000 case winery, which becomes a lot of pressure and almost contributed to the consulting side of it. But while I was at that Virginia winery, I also was able to work at a Napa winery called Leduc at the time. That label is now Eller's. So Eller's label, which a lot of their proceeds now go to cardiovascular disease and research. I believe his estate gives $20 to $30 million a year to that. With that came a lot of nice consulting from Jacques Boissonneau, who's no longer on this earth, but outstanding Bordeaux consultant. And I owe a lot of what I know to him and how to approach wine. So that's a bit of my background. And since we're here on basically yeast and yeast health, I'll try to jump right into that. And I hope it's okay to do a little bit of a commercial, but I also, not for me, but I guess, just drawing a blank on that. So Scott Labs, if you don't have this book, you might want to go ahead and reach out and grab that. Okay, so Scott Labs, or you can go to scottlabs.com. I highly recommend the print copy. And boy, you're going to read about all sorts of yeast in here. I'll also narrow it down to probably 2 yeast that I find the most important. So if you got a pen and paper, I'm willing to share those. And it also was reinforced by a gentleman who worked for Lallemand, I believe. And Dave, you may have remembered him, but Clayton Cohn used to come and speak at some of the seminars. But working with white wines, I prefer the Prix de Mousse and the 1118. Okay, so that's great for white wines and rosés. I've actually noticed some of the literature has actually started to recommend it more for reds. I don't have an understanding as to why, but these are, the 1118 is a very good strong yeast. It's going to convert many of the things you want it to do. In other words, sugar into alcohol, and it will do so without much or any H2S. And I've done a number of trials where I compared a lot of yeast. And when we took those trials out during fermentation, many of the yeast will give a lot of different floral characteristics. But as we compared these trials, 8 months, 10 months, and 12 months down the road, we found many of those characteristics all came together and we saw less of a difference. Now, you may see that differently. That's kind of what I've seen over the years. For a red wine, and I see the book is also really suggesting that, is for whites and rosés, is the 1116. And so some people refer to that as K1. Again, the previous yeast was Prix de Mousse or 1118. For red wines, I like to use K1 or 1116. And that'll give you the, say, the foundation, perhaps maybe the two best yeast that I prefer and recommend for these wines. And that's really the reasons behind them. So we could talk about questions on other yeast down the road, but then we might step into yeast hydration and acclimation. Now this is very important, and the acclimation process we didn't really have early on. So I've been able to see through my career the graduation of how well we handle yeast. And so the hydration period for both of these yeast, and make sure to read the container, some are a little bit different. So we'll often add to hydration water, roughly 2 pounds per 1,000 gallons. That's what I stalled earlier. A lot of my rates are going to be on the commercial rates. You guys might have to scale it down to the smaller level if necessary. So a yeast is usually 25 grams per hectoliter or 2 pounds per 1,000 gallons. And then the acclimation process is often we'll draw water at about 106 degrees Fahrenheit. I know both of these yeasts do prefer that temperature, so 106 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know the exact ratio, believe it or not. I believe it might be 5 grams of water for every gram of yeast. I'd have to research that one, but I know I can usually do about 1,000 grams and about 2 gallons of water, which would really treat about 1,000 gallons. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. So once you have that 1,000 or 106 degree Fahrenheit water, which is very important, again, I'm in the cellar, so you have to adapt this over, but I'll take a 3-finger pinch of Fermate. Fermate is actually from Scott as well. I'll then take a 3-finger pinch of yeast hulls and put that in the hydration water, and I'll mix it. Now in our world, we're in a cellar, and Presque Isle used to sell these. It's a stainless steel rod with Teflons on the end. And so it might be about 24 inches. And I'll use this in the 5-gallon bucket, and I'll mix it very well. I'll also get about, this is again in maybe 2.5 gallons of water. I'll get about 50 milliliters of juice. Now, Scott doesn't recommend that necessarily, but I do find just a little sugar nutrient really does help these yeast take off. Not enough to be sacriphilic, but enough to give them just a flavor, if you will. But then once I've got all of those ingredients in that bucket, I'll go ahead and use the drill mixer, and I will have already pre-opened these 500 gram tins, if you will. They're like coffee packs of yeast. I will have opened them with a razor knife or a pair of scissors, had them sitting open, and I'll use the drill mixer and I'll dump the first container in and then quickly dump the second container in, all while I'm drill mixing. But immediately after I get that yeast in and under the surface of the water, I'll stop mixing. Now, I've talked to some of the Scott people. They don't like that I do that. But I do know that the yeast really do like it, or at least my fermentations go well. Once you stop mixing that first time, you're going to want to wait about 20 minutes and resist going by and doing anything with them. If you're rehydrating in a 5-gallon bucket, about 2.5 gallons of warm water in there at that 104 degrees now that it's dropped. You may have an extra container nearby. You may see so much foaming and frothing of this yeast that you may have to pour some of that foam over. It's still good yeast, but you don't want the bucket, which happens sometimes, overflowing in the cellar, and now your expensive yeast are just hitting the drain, at which point you don't try to use them. You would rinse them away. But again, once you've patiently waited for about 20 minutes, you can then walk back up, and I highly encourage you to do so, but to walk back up with your cordless drill and use one of these mixers. Now you can buy a stainless steel mixer of any sort, paint mixer. Just make sure it's only been used for yeast. And I'll drill mix those yeast fairly severely. I'll even take that 5-gallon bucket or more of yeast and pour it back and forth from bucket to bucket. And really what we want to do here is introduce a lot of oxygen into those yeast. And what we're told, and I believe it's true, is these yeast will take in that oxygen and bring it into their vacuoles and become a more healthy yeast, as well as these amounts of oxygen help them want to replicate and build larger numbers. So again, I'll drill mix it a little bit, but then you start to go into the acclimation process. And so this is slowly bringing the temperature of that 104-degree water downward toward the temperature of your juice. In our case, in most cases, our juice might be at 50 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm speaking mainly here about a white wine. If I were crushing grapes for red, I hope my must is 65 or 70. But for a white wine, for example, we might be at 50 degrees Fahrenheit. I'll usually put my tub now. It'll be probably a 30-gallon tub. I'm no longer in the 5-gallon bucket. Usually under a sample valve or somewhere where I can just meter in some cold 50-degree Fahrenheit juice into this yeast bucket. And that's usually while other operations are going on, but the intent is to bring down the yeast temperature from 104 degrees Fahrenheit down to 10 degrees about every 20 minutes. And usually winery environments are cold, so the bucket even setting in that winery environment is starting to acclimate as well. This can go on throughout the day, and often I will encourage it to go on throughout the day. I'm in no hurry to add that yeast. Again, I'll continue to drill mix it and give it lots of oxygen while I'm bringing that temperature down. So usually I'm going to say toward the latter part of the day, you may have racked this cold settled juice over from tank to tank. Maybe that happened by 9:30 in the morning. Your acclimation might go all the way through to 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It can go quicker than that. But again, I'm not in any hurry. So I'll usually time my workload in that day to go ahead and add my yeast at the very end of the day. Now you can pump the yeast with a pump, or if you're working with a bucket, you can dump that bucket in the top of the tank. I don't often intentionally mix the tank. I don't find that really necessary. It doesn't harm it, but there's no real need to do that. Now, when you start thinking of the drill mixer, if you've got a magnetic stir bar and you're working in smaller quantities, you could by all means hydrate your yeast with a stir plate. Of course, let it set for 20 minutes, and then you could start the stir plate again. So that can be a nice way to do that. And then for the yeast nutrients, of course, I've done my 3-finger pinch of Fermate and 3-finger pinch of yeast hulls in my bucket. But if I have not measured my FAN, free available nitrogen, or my YAN, my yeast available nitrogen, I may go on a protocol and usually recommend, if we don't have those numbers, is to go ahead and add about 2 pounds per 1,000 gallons Fermate. So once again, 2 pounds per 1,000 gallons Fermate, and anywhere in the range of 2 pounds to 3 pounds per 1,000 gallons yeast hulls. Yeast hulls tend to be, I'm just going to call it this, organics, maybe not the more natural. It really doesn't give any nitrogen, but the yeast really do like these dead yeast cells, is what they are. So yeast hulls. We're finding those harder to find, by the way, but I do know you can still call Scott Labs. They do have them in a 44-pound bag, which is a lot. But BSG also sells those. Or Enartis might do that. And I'm going to touch on Enartis here in a little bit toward the end. So that is the 2 to 3 pounds per 1,000 gallons of yeast hulls. And then I'll also add about 2 pounds per 1,000 gallons of diammonium phosphate. So 2 pounds per 1,000 diammonium phosphate. If you've got fruit that's compromised or perhaps damaged, a little bit of rot, often those wilder microbes might actually lower your nitrogen. So if you suspect that, you could add more. If you're working with concentrates, I suspect that you might need more diammonium phosphate. I've not tested it, but just knowing the process, that could be an issue as well. So I'll add the yeast hulls, fermate, diammonium phosphate, either directly to the juice, but well dissolved, and then add it to the tank. It can be within a day or two, really, of inoculation. So if we were to add sugar and maybe we haven't run the calculation, we may run it the next day. I might add those nutrients the next day. Now, there is a lot of talk about, of course, feeding these yeast in increments, hopefully before you reach 10 bricks. That's usually the caveat. That I find that when the harvest gets going in our real life winemaking world, so many curveballs are thrown at us that it's not to say metering these nutrients out isn't a good thing, but I find I have more success getting it all in my tanks so that I have a good fermentation. Part of that healthy fermentation is temperature control. So I'll let once I've added my yeast, and in this case it's a white wine because reds do ferment a little bit warmer, but you figure we're at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, I'll set my controllers on my tanks up to 70. That's only a place to catch it, okay? But usually within a day and a half to 2 days, fermentation will have started. And I would say just starting out, if you're able to do so, if once you see fermentation starts, and what I mean by that is you see the tank rolling, you could open the lid of the tank and put your head in. And I mean, it's telltale. Your head will come back. That is fermentation. You can chill a yeast like Pris de Mousse down to about 45 degrees Fahrenheit. I've even taken it lower, but I feel safe that if you took it to 45, that would be good. You can usually allow it to ferment at 45 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the fermentation until you get to about 1,030 specific gravity. And sorry, I know I've changed from bricks to specific gravity, but that's typically what I do. Just mainly, I bet my European training and influence has me doing that. I want to say that might be in the 6 bricks range, but don't hold me to that. Google can help you out there. But once I get to that temperature or that specific gravity, I'll again allow everything to warm up and hopefully go into a better finishing off mode so that I go dry. I typically like to ferment everything dry, and then if I have to back sweeten, we can back sweeten. So that pretty much, maybe to touch on reds. Reds, if you can inoculate warmer, I do like to do that. I think we became in a habit of, we were chilling all of our white fruit very cold, 45, 50 degrees Fahrenheit. We started doing that on the reds. I think that was maybe a mistake, an accidental mistake. If I can time it to where the reds are picked at 65, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, do the same yeast acclimation, hydration process, get the fermentation going, and hopefully hold that fermentation in a macro bin typically up to about 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Sometimes it will go more, sometimes less, but once again at about 1,030 specific gravity, I'm usually trying to get those bins into more heat so that I can finish that off dry. I might even press off before they go completely dry. I did want to, it's not that I'm all just about Scott Labs, but an artist also has a book, a bunch of nutrients and everything. Oh boy, do you want this up? I don't know if I've timed out or if you all can still, but I think I'm still on. At least 2 things I do like about an artist's products, and I like more than that. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes it's just because of ease, how we get kind of with one company or another. But if I have troubles with my malolactic, I can often just go ahead and closing something out here. Oh boy. We can turn to a malolactic bacteria called silver. And sometimes if VP41 won't work, silver will. Or if you want a lot of diacetyl buttery character, MCW is sold through an artist. I like that product, and lots of good lab glassware and so on. So in summary, really, you want to make your yeast as happy as you can. The acclimation or the rehydration water temperature, chlorine-free water, by the way. Make sure that it's not distilled water, but hopefully tap water and chlorine-free. Temperature should start at about 106. By the time you get everything in there and drill mix it, you'll be down to about 104. You can add your yeast. Don't mix anymore. Go about 20 minutes, just letting it set there. Then you can start to drill mix, pour it back and forth. You could do it if it's smaller quantity, beakers in the lab. Then acclimate that yeast downward so that you're within 5 to 10 degrees range of the tank that you're going to inoculate. And then either measure for your nutrients, or if you don't have the capabilities for that measurement, you could go with those 2 pounds per thousand permade, 2 pounds per thousand yeast hulls, and 2 pounds per thousand diammonium phosphate. And I believe there's other superfoods and things like that out there. So hopefully that gives a good summary for good yeast starting and
That's great, Tom. Hey, well, thank you very much, Tom. Before we get on with questions, I'd like to do the giveaway, if you don't mind.
Oh, sure.
We have a copy of the book of our last presenter for our winemaker series, Dan Pombianchi's Modern Home Winemaking. But this question involves Tom and I. Now, Mr. Payette is famous for a lot of things. One of the things he's famous for is a quote he gave me for an article about Cabernet Franc. So I doubt anybody's going to know this. You might want to go to Google. I did an article a long time ago, so I'll give you this. If you search for Fall Check Payette and Cabernet Franc, you're probably going to come up with it. Cut and paste the quote that Tom gave me about Cabernet Franc and put it in the chat. The first person who does that, who's an AWS member, please make sure you're an AWS member. You can get this book sent to you along with our thanks. It's a great book, 600 pages. What a reference behemoth this is. And yeah, it was. I'm waiting to see. I don't see any folks coming in. Like I said, it's Tom Payette's quote about Cabernet Franc, specifically East Virginia Cabernet Franc. You know, these children of the South have a very colorful way of talking. Anybody? It was for a website called Appalachian America. My name only has one C. Tom's name, 2 T's. In the meantime, Tom, while we're waiting for that, I do have a question that was sent in by a listener. This is a question about racking off the gross lease, Tom. This question, I believe this is from John Comfel of Pennsylvania. He says, what timetable do you recommend to rack a new wine from the gross lease? He has heard it said that racking should not occur until the wine is dry, less than 1 specific gravity, although he has racked prior to this. How would this affect balance and fruit? Do you have thoughts about that? And what types of wines do you think might lend themselves to this procedure? There's a lot in there, Tom. How do you unpack that?
That is a lot. Since I tend to go dry, I would say I like to rack just after fermentation. Now, harvested again is a busy time, and how urgent is racking off just after fermentation? Of course, we'll use hydrometers, and maybe I should have even touched on this, but you can also buy these things called Clinitest tablets. They're not very expensive, and it just takes 10 drops of wine in a test tube and the tablet, and if it burns dark green or dark blue or hunter green, that's a way to also help determine whether it's dry or not. Obviously, the wine glass helps too, but you could have those 3 things that would tell you you're dry. If I find that on Friday it might have dried up and I've still got some weekends available, I may not rack it off until Monday. But I don't stay too long. Now, let's say it went dry on Wednesday. I'm definitely going to rack it by Friday. I might even rack it Thursday. I might even rack it that Wednesday. You know, if you do rack it earlier, there is a chance you could stick it. It's harder to stick one with Pret a Mousse, but that's not to say it's impossible. So if you do want to say a slightly sweeter wine, you could try Epernay 2 yeast or something that's a little more fragile, especially if you can chill it off. And in this case, I might try to chill the tanks down, or in this case, if you can put a smaller quantity in a freezer or refrigerator, you could chill it down and then rack it. And then often I'll add about 50 to 70 parts per million SO2 at that first racking. It may sound like a lot, but what we tend to do is to stack up our tanks. We're not really measuring a whole lot in the lab, and we position them so that by the time we can turn our focus to the lab, where our wines are good with SO2. So did that kind of, racking it off the gross leaves, unless it's a Surly Chardonnay, and then you're going to leave it on its gross leaves perhaps and go into a stirring regime. So there are times that we don't, but there's a higher chance of getting reductiveness. Rack it sooner than later.
Very good, Tom. Let's see, we do have a winner for the competition, everyone, and the winner is Santina Ballesteri. I apologize if I butchered your name, of the Pittsburgh chapter. And he found the quote, and the quote is from Tom Payette: "I've always said we would never achieve greatness with Cabernet Franc. Now I realize we've stuck our kid in the mud. It's no wonder he can't run." And it was in that era when everyone thought that of the Bordeaux grapes, that Cabernet Franc was the most ironclad. So they put it in the most terrible areas. And of course, the results were bad. And people thought, well, Cabernet Franc must be bad. And Tom was commenting about this revelation where winemakers and growers realized, we really haven't been treating our Cabernet Franc very well, but we've been treating our Cabernet Sauvignon real well, putting it on the hills and getting the most sun. So that was the nature of that comment. Do you remember that now, Tom?
I do. And I think even Lucy Morton's one of the people that kind of even said that somewhere at a conference as well, but she was dead on. And, we'd already planted everything. Here came along Cab Franc, this promise, and okay, well, let's plant it in the valley here. But we've definitely come away from that thinking lately, and it is quite shining.
Okay. All right, Tom, we have another question for you from Erin O'Reilly. And she is asking, what are some telltale signs you might see in a fermentation that indicates you're having problems with nutrients? What do you think?
Well, mostly it would be either sluggishness or hydrogen sulfide. So, I like to smell and taste my fermentations daily if possible. And in fact, in a winery, sometimes you can just walking through the winery tell which tank might be getting stinky. Just you can almost stand next to it and tell which tank it is. But that would be the telltale sign is, again, just H2S, so rotten egg aromatics. Or if you measure specific gravity daily, and you really should, is if you're seeing both temperature and specific gravity starting to slow down the kinetics of that fermentation, that could be an area where you might have nutrient issues. Now, let's go back to that whole 10 bricks scenario. If this is happening after 10 bricks, what I'm told is basically as a yeast ferments, it creates alcohol. And as it does that, it'll start to, as it gets more alcohol in solution, it's going to almost create a shield and isolate itself off from that juice and pulling nutrients or anything else through its cell wall. So if we're beyond 10 bricks and we add nutrients, there's a high likelihood this yeast will never get those nutrients. And so if we're going to try to use this tool of maybe adding nutrients later, or just when they see issues, you may say, well, wait a minute, I better get these nutrients in early on, because if I see symptoms late, those nutrients may not help at all. And I do believe that. I've seen it.
That's interesting, Tom. That leads into a question from Greg Ambrose. He asked about the timing of nutrient additions. And I know that's something winemakers can argue about for quite a bit, but I'm guessing it's probably situational. What do you think about the timing of those nutrient additions during fermentation?
Good. I think in a perfect world, again, I think, you might add the nutrients. So add the yeast in day one, let's say. This is, and then day 2 or 3, add some nutrients. and maybe a third. There's a lot of discussion out there in a perfect world. So on day 2, if you could add 1/3 your nutrients, go to maybe about 14 or maybe even 16 bricks, add the next third, and then go to near 11 bricks and add the next third. That should work. But again, what I find is sometimes our fermenters race through and we don't catch that last addition. So I'm more likely to put my nutrients in very much up front. I'll even give a fermentation vessel some air in order to have it actually continue to pull in some oxygen perhaps. So that might be a good feeding regime. If you can't do it then, I'd get it all in up front.
Right. Yeah. Frank Rinaldi mentioned Yan meters, but those are probably out of reach for a lot of home winemakers. Is a Yan? I have a question for. Do Yan meters detect yeast assimilable nitrogen or total nitrogen? And is that something that's within reach for home winemakers?
Funny, there's a tool that we're going to play with this year, and apparently you can plug it into your pH meter. And I think I'm drawing a blank on it. Venmetrica, maybe. Venmetric, and I'm a skeptical. I'm a doubting Thomas, okay? And so what we're going to do is to get this unit in, but I'm also going to send samples off to an outside lab and see how well we can dial that in. To be honest, I'm not sure whether it's yeast available nitrogen or the FAN or the Yan, the free available nitrogen, on which it might measure. I'm not even certain I understand the difference. So
well, the one yeast is bound. Well, the one nitrogen is bound up, and the yeast can't even use it, so it's kind of worthless.
Well, and if you follow the whole yeast nutrient, I believe if you look back several years, they were recommending 350 parts per million. I could be wrong on that, but then they seem to, the academic world, pull it back to about 250 parts per million. I have run nitrogen through an outside lab, and one client, we calculated what we needed to add, and it was going to be 6 pounds per 1,000 diammonium phosphate.
Oh.
I ran the math, and that was my reaction was, his name was Bill. I said, Bill, this is the calculation. That's what we're supposed to do. I wouldn't do it. We might have bumped it up to 3 pounds per 1,000, but we didn't have, I'm going to say, nitrogen sensitive yeast. And I don't remember that going sideways on us or it going stinky or having any issues. So it's one of those, what are you going to do with the information when you get it?
Right.
I can use these units to hopefully lower the amount of diammonium phosphate I might add. It's going to be harder for it to push me to add more.
Right.
Yeah.
Greg Stricker mentioned something called Venmetrica that measures Yan. Are you familiar with that? What is
that?
That
I believe is the one I was trying to recall, and it should be just an attachment to a pH meter, or it uses the pH meter in some other chemicals. I don't run these as much myself anymore, so I might not be as much in the dirty details of that lab.
God. Make sure you buffer and calibrate your pH meters, everybody.
Absolutely, and that's true with even just pH readings.
Right. Here, we have a question here, Tom. Oh, I'm looking at it in print. I can't see who suggested it. Do you have any recommendations for yeast that for very high brick musts, for example, 30 bricks?
Yeah, 30 bricks is very high. So that you might have to even dilute down and keep your culture almost acclimated, let's call it. So you might bring it down to 25 or 27 bricks in a small vessel on the side, get this, and then meter your juice back in before you kind of go all in. But basically pre-to-mousse. That's, I would say, a go-to. In fact, I have some clients, we like to make ports, usually out of Chambourcin, but other grape varieties will work. We've had good success getting up to 20% alcohol. You've got to really catch these yeast at the feeding frenzy time. You might be adding sugar 3 times a day, 4 times a day. But if you catch that momentum of that fermentation, you can get to 19 and 20% alcohol. I believe there's also another yeast, I'm going to call it, is it Q43 or just even 43? It should go into a very high alcohol state.
Very good. Okay, our friend Leo Sperazza from the great city of Pittston. He's asking what the relation, is there a relationship between punch down and nutrients and oxygen brought in during punch down?
I believe there is. I don't think it's been measured, but we, in the olden days, used to do more tank fermentations, and we were good about doing a lot of splash rackings, but it does go back to that introduction of oxygen. So when we're doing macro bends, of course, we will pull the cover, and lately the cover is really just a clear sheet of plastic with a large 36-inch rubber band that's wrapped around it. So we'll pull the cover and usually shake it. It looks like there's water on that plastic. That's typically alcohol. So shake it, get that alcohol off, take it to the side, and do a good vigorous punch down. And I believe that really the macro bin capacity, that's a decent amount of oxygen going in. Now, during the frenzy of fermentation, it's harder to get that oxygen to go into a supersaturated carbon dioxide solution or environment. I believe it still helps. And if you think you need more air, you can obviously extend your punch down or try to raise that must up in the air a little bit.
Right, right. I would remind everyone to check out the chat. Dan Scheffler shared a link to the Vinmetrica test kit, and Greg Ambrose mentioned he had success with Restart 43 for high Brix must.
Perfect, yes. And actually, to go back to the red wine fermentation, if you felt you needed more oxygen in that fermenter, you could siphon off some liquid, use that drill mixer again, or pour it bucket back and forth and get it very saturated with oxygen, and then pour that bucket back into your macro bin. And that might help give you more oxygen into that fermentation vessel.
Frank asked if you have experience with non-Saccharomyces yeast.
I have not, other than, I guess, I'm trying to think. Brettanomyces is a Bionis, so Saccharomyces bionis, and then 1116 or K1 is a Cerevisiae. So when we're dealing in thousands of dollars, it is much tougher to experiment and turn to someone and say, well, this 500-gallon tank just went bad. Luckily, I don't see much of that, but I think it's also because of keeping good, tight controls on our fermentations. And so I'm often slow to experiment. I'll keep my ear out for others that have and find out how things went for them.
You know, when home winemakers ask me about native yeast fermentation, I usually say, well, you know, it's kind of like leaving your young children with a stranger. You know, it might work out, might not work out.
Right. Yes. And now native yeast is even another step, and very rarely play with that. And that or extended maceration, which is really just leaving yourself open for outside.
Well, we have another question that deals with that remotely. It's a fine lease question. Do you recommend letting wine sit on its fine lease? Are batonnage or sur-lie required for this, or could the wine just remain static? And if so, for how long?
Yes, and there's a lot of, I'm going to say, quantification into that. What would I consider light lees versus someone else? And would you need to stir or do batonnage? If it's been, let's say it fermented all the way to dryness and it finished on Friday, and you waited till Monday to rack, and you did a good clean racking off those gross lees, I might then consider that light lees. At the same time, I've thought they were light lees, racked the tank the second time, and wow, look at all these lees. So you've really kind of got to get your radar on where those light lees are. If I was questionable, I would definitely mix and stir and do sur-lie batonnage. And then I would ask myself, what am I gaining? So really the only thing I keep on sur-lie anymore, and I shouldn't say it that way, but mostly Chardonnay. We've done some Chardonnay that way and recently some Vermentino. But at least I know they're on their heavy lees. We ferment in that barrel, and I know what to expect from that. And in that case, I will stir the barrel once every 2 weeks. After the fermentation up until about January 1. And then through smell and taste, I might allow it to go for a month. So you've really got to dial in, are they really light lees? And if they're not, how much do I need to stir? If they're really light lees, you may not need to stir, but how much longer are you going to keep it on?
Very good. If anybody wants to mic off and ask a question of Tom, IRL, we probably have time for one or two more questions.
Actually, I'd like to ask a question.
Sure,
David?
Jeff, go ahead.
Okay, so I have a tendency, let's just go with red grapes. I'll press them, I'll wait 2 or 3 days, depending on what it looks like the lees are settling. And I'll do a pretty good job of getting it off the gross lees. And that's when I add mallow, and that's when I add oak chips, because we're generally doing 5-6 gallon carboys. I'll go 3 months before I'll check the mallow with a chromatography and make sure it's done. Should I be, because you're saying even light lees, and they're pretty light at that point, should I still be stirring in that 3 months, or do I need to just leave them alone?
Well, for malolactic, it won't hurt. And it sounds like those chips, believe it or not, that those chips will help ward off any reductiveness. I won't say any, but some, because really that wood has oxygen in it too. And so it's giving that away. I find if I stir my barrels, they go through malolactic actually much faster. And even more so, we've been using reefer trucks, not only for chilling fruit, but then turning around and doing malolactic in them. And they scream through. I'm in the classic 20-day time frame, which is pretty fast. And so I think it's the vibration of the truck that helps. But I would stir that, you know how you can take a carboy and kind of roll it around and get it to stir. I don't see that there would be any harm to that, and it would help you stay away from any reductiveness. And I forget, I think you said you went about 3 months, was it?
Well, in 3 months, it's always done. So I
Yeah.
generally, and I have good success. So I generally haven't done anything shorter, but I guess, between stirring it and just trying it shorter, I could. And I probably will now.
And it's neat. What I tend to find is I say it's like having my britches down to my knees. We've gone through fermentation. We're warming to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. We've got a malolactic bug in there. And so I'm testing it. And my goal is usually to try to get things finished up by November, racked and sulfur dioxide added. So I like to test it and catch it as soon as possible after malolactic as I can. The same thing applies if it tests through malolactic on Friday. I don't rush in Saturday morning. I might wait till Monday or Tuesday. It's not urgent. It's okay. That's next on the list kind of thing.
But the quicker you're throwing meta in there, the better.
I feel that way again. It's a livelihood versus an experiment in some respects. So we've got to make sure that we catch it and we don't see surface films and things like that.
Thank you.
Yeah. If it works, keep doing it. And that stirring might be nice. It might add some body. Yeah.
Well, it's not like it requires a lot of wine in a pipette or, a whole sheet of chromatography paper.
Right.
It makes sense to do it quicker.
Yeah, little capillary tubes, and you're right. It's time though, but yeah, fun. I still use them. They're still an inexpensive way to monitor malolactic. And if some clients want to know the number, we'll send it out to the lab. But either they go through or they don't. And
Hey, it's a lot easier than that. Has the color changed when you're trying to do TA from must?
right.
All right, great. Thanks for that question, Jeff. We got time for one more. Anybody else have a burning question before we say goodbye to Tom? Well, looks like that's it. Well, Tom, I got to tell you, it was great to see you. And I want to thank you for coming out and sharing your knowledge with us. I think everybody's really appreciative. Everybody, if you want to give Tom a hello or a nice little applause.
Thank you all.
I put a link to Tom's website in the chat if you want to see it. And the thanks are rolling in from coast to coast, Tom.
No, thank you all. I enjoyed it. It was a pleasure and an honor, but thank you very much.
Thanks. And don't forget, October 6th, Frank Rinaldi will be here to talk about adjusting and managing tannins. So we're going to move the ball even more for everybody. So, keep making great wine out there, folks, and have a great night.
All right.
Cheers.
Thanks. Cheers.